Hi, I'm Rebecca McLean, Executive Director of Oneida County History Center here in Utica, New York. We're a local history museum that has been around since 1876. We offer monthly programs, changing exhibits, a bookstore, plus a research library and archive. About 2 years ago, we hired Patrick to build new exhibits and develop educational programs. Shortly after he started working here, he became obsessed with a map that we owned. And then he started telling some crazy stories about it. He's talking about a general in the Revolutionary War and beavers. It is a cool drawing, a general map of the Honorable William Frederick Baron Steuben's manor from 1794. It turns out to be a one-of-a-kind map that is one of the earliest examples of large-scale landscape planning in America, which is kind of a big deal. But there's much more to the story than the drawing. For that, I will turn you over to Patrick Reynolds, Director of Public Programs at the History Center. He will tell you more about the drawing and, of course, the beavers.
This map is on paper. It's about 18 inches across. It's done in watercolors and ink and dates to 1794. The plan for the proposed estate covers 1,500 acres. Shows a dwelling house, gardens, and pond. And an esplanade. It's a long level area which people can walk for pleasure. Shows a spring, stables, fields for crops, schoolhouse, and a sawmill. Curious aspect about the plan is that it's round. Usually maps from this time period are square or rectangles. It's kind of intriguing. The Oneida County History Center has been around since 1876. We've had this map for a long time. We knew it was the plan for the Baron's estate, but our museum really didn't understand the complex story of how this drawing came to be. This is the story behind that drawing. The story that will make a connection between Baron Steuben, waterfall, and beavers. So who was Baron Steuben? He was a Prussian military officer. During the Revolutionary War, he came to the colonies to support George Washington and train the troops. He famously acted as the drill master of Valley Forge. He's credited as one of the founders of the U.S. Army. He was described as, and I quote, a quirky mercenary who was not really a baron. He magically transformed the threadbare troops into a fighting force. Statues of him were put up in his honor at Valley Forge, New York City, and Utica. He supposedly could curse at you in 5 languages. Now, after the Revolutionary War, the U.S. government found it had to pay Baron Steuben back and had more land than money. So to compensate him for his services, he was given 1,600 acres of land in northern Oneida County. Here he built a simple log cabin. Not a big elaborate house, just a little log cabin. Get started with rooms for himself and 2 servants. The plan shown on the drawing is much larger and more elaborate. It shows a rather fancy, formal estate. To understand the story of this drawing, we've got to start on the other side of the Atlantic to France in 1792. Just in case you weren't familiar with it, 1792 there was a revolution going on in France. The working class were so oppressed that they were rising up and killing off the wealthy aristocracy. So much so that they were in fear for their lives. So a group of rich Frenchmen gathered together and developed a plan to save themselves from the French Revolution. They formed the Company of New York, or the New York Company. They sold shares to investors and soon bought 200,000 acres of land, sight unseen, from a man named William Constable. This land was located on the Black River in remote northern New York. The name Constable might be familiar to some people in central New York. In Lewis County, there's a magnificent home called Constable Hall. It was built by William Constable's son, William Constable Jr. Several years later. It was completed in 1819. It's operated today as a museum by the state. The father, William, was in England at the time when the purchase was negotiated. Maps being what they were back then, things did not go quite as planned. The French aristocracy had grand plans for this new settlement, in which they built two full-blown cities, Basile and Castorville. Castorland and Castorville come from the French word castor, it's the French word for beaver. They planned to trap beaver and sell the fur, which could be made into fashionable hats and other pieces of clothing. If you were to believe the maps of the time, the marshy tract was full of beavers and otters. Many Europeans, especially these Frenchmen, didn't really understand what beavers were really like. Early illustrations depicted them as thick as fleas in the woods, vigorously cutting down trees, building dams, and even carrying mud on their tails, which, we know isn't true. The company planned to make a profit by utilizing natural resources of the New World. They would harvest lumber. They would tap the trees and make maple sugar. Although they didn't realize you could only make it in the spring, they thought you could make it all year round. But they also planned to grow grapes. The land they bought, they were looking at it on the map, was the same latitude as France's wine region, so why not? They had the greatest hopes of having a great time living off the land and exporting products from up on the Black River. But if you didn't know it, it's not like France. It has some of the most challenging winters in America. And despite their best intentions, they had a somewhat naive plan of how things were going to work. On the plus side, it was beautiful virgin forest. They could build their log homes and cities, raise their family, and be safe from the dangers of France and the Revolution. To get things started, the Company of New York sent 2 agents to check things out and start the colony. Simon Desjardins and Pierre Faroux. Desjardins and Faroux were well-educated gentlemen who were considered surveyors and architects. In 1793, they began their journey to the New World to explore and investigate the lands that the Company of New York had purchased. We know the details of this story because the 2 agents were required to keep a journal. It's over 600 pages long. They talk about nature and the birds and the fish they tried to eat and the few people that they met. A new translation by John Gallucci was published by Cornell University in 1991. That's how I found out about this story. I encourage you to further investigate it if you're interested. It's an amazing read. It's very dense reading with names and places without a lot of explanation. If you're not familiar with the area's history, it's hard to tell what's happening. Part of the reason I put together this version of the story, specifically relating to the map of Baron Steuben's estate. In the summer of 1793, Desjardins and Faroux finally got on a ship and sailed across the ocean. On the way, they met a young man whose name was Marc Brunel. Marc Brunel was also leaving France and looking for new things to do. He didn't really have a plan, but he knew he wanted to leave France and see the new world and see what he could do here. He was also very well educated, surveyor, and he's referred to as what is known as a mechanic at the time. Meant he was good at engineering and fixing things. And after a long journey, the group ended up in New York City. They quickly made their way up to Albany, the last significant settlement on the edge of New York's wilderness. It's here that Brunel decided to accompany Desjardins and Faroux to the Black River. In Albany, they met two other gentlemen, Philip Schuyler and Simeon DeWitt. During the Revolutionary War, Schuyler fought at Saratoga and some other battles, and after war he was a politician and businessman. In 1793 he was involved in creating a company called the Western Inland Lock and Navigation Company. It was a private company working to improve the navigations on the Mohawk River and the route to Lake Ontario, which was the way west at the time. In Albany, they also met Simeon DeWitt, who had been the state surveyor general for many years. He knew more than anyone about traveling in upstate New York. So after the two Frenchmen told Schuyler and DeWitt where they were going, trying to get to the Black River, they responded that the only way you're going to get there is by boat. There were no roads to where they were going. So they got a boat, specifically Mohawk River Bateau. They began their journey up the Mohawk River to Little Falls. In Little Falls, Schuyler had connected them with Frederick Desang. He was a mercenary who was working for him up there. He knew the people on the river and the best way to get to the Black River. He joined them as they continued their journey up the Mohawk River and went to the Great Carry, or the Oneida Carry, then Oneida Lake, all the way around through Lake Ontario, all the way up to the Black River. This area of the Black River in 1793 was really devoid of Europeans. The winters are terribly long and cold. There were no settlers except for an occasional trapper. The native people occasionally used the area for a hunting ground. The Oneida Indians would go up there, but it was a place where few lived year-round. The nearest were down in the Mohawk Valley or up in Canada. Well, they got there and they began to survey and determine what the land was and what it was like. Soon found out that because there was a waterfall, this would change some of their plans. They couldn't build the inland cities that they were planning. The insurmountable waterfalls were in the way. The river's course didn't match the map they used to negotiate for the deed, and they began to wonder about the land they purchased. It looked like they were going to get shortchanged by hundreds, if not thousands of acres. It was during this fall that Mark Brunel made a little drawing. It depicts the camp on the Black River in October of 1793. 4 of them had made the remarkable journey into a vast wilderness. Brunel's drawing shows a homey canvas tent, a fire, a cooking pot, some trees of this virgin forest. The drawing is now in a museum in England, and hopefully they can hear this story and realize the context of this simple sketch, because it's a rather early depiction of the Black River, probably the first one. But it was late in the season and getting cold. It was soon going to snow. Our troop of adventurers made their way back, down across Lake Ontario, then by river to Lake Oneida. They stopped at a little settlement called Constantia. Desjardins and Peru went to the nearby Oneida Indian Reservation. They met with the elders, hoping to find some laborers who would come back up with them to the Black River the following year. They continued towards Albany, traveled overland to Utica, then known as Old Fort Schuyler. They met one of the first storekeepers in Utica named Mr. Post. Instead of staying at his trading post and tavern, they chose to stay in their tent. They declared Mr. Post's tavern was one of the filthiest lodgings in all of upstate New York. Rather than go and live inside with the filth, they'd stay outside in their own tent. The History Center owns the stove from Mr. Post's store, all 410 pounds of it. His store eventually burned down. The Frenchmen also saw the bridge over the Mohawk River in Utica. It's been washed out. It's a sizable bridge built by a local carpenter. It had troubles from the start, washed away by the Mohawk River. They continued their journey down the valley, reaching Schenectady and Albany. That winter and spring, they went in a walkabout in America, taking the opportunity to get out of the woods, trying to attract settlers and workers to Castorland and maybe sell some of the little plots of land. Independently, they did some side work along the way. 1794, Faroux created a proposal for a planned town of Esperanza. It was a city across from Hudson, New York. The drawing was later engraved into a beautiful formal plan. Faroux also did some architecture in that winter. America was searching for a new type of architecture that had yet to be defined, and he tried his hand at some of that, including designing a fantastic house for a Dutchman named Van Rensselaer in 1794. This house still exists in Columbia County on the east side of the Hudson. Interesting house. It's not quite eight-sided, but it's atypical of what were being built or designed in America at the time. The summer of 1794, they began their second season. This time as they go north, they go by water at first, but instead of going a long way around Lake Ontario, they go by way of Fort Schuyler, which is now the city of Rome. They travel north to Baron Steuben's house by wagon, drawn by horses or oxen. Baron Steuben let them set up a storehouse. Here they put barrels of meat, corn flour, cornmeal, of course a reserve of wine or rum. There really wasn't a road. Trappers had used some trails, but it was rough wilderness, cutting their way through northern New York. Eventually they made their way to the high falls on the Black River, and this is where they built one of the earliest structures in the Castorland farm at High Falls, which is now Lyons Falls. You can visit there today, or almost. It's on private land, but very close to where the Castor settlement was. It's never been built on or developed. There's a public fishing spot where you can see the waterfalls at Lyons Falls and the vestiges of a paper mill that once was located there. So now that they're settled, they could finally start their settlement at High Falls. They built 2 log houses connected by a roof, had a workspace underneath to escape the rain. And it's depicted on a drawing which still exists. It was done by Faroux in 1794. The small crew began clearing land and surveying. This summer, they were also introduced to a new menace, mosquitoes. They were incredibly bad from all the accounts. Black flies as well, biting their hands and making them bleed. Caused tremendous suffering for these French aristocrats who weren't used to the wilds of upstate New York and everything that comes with that. So they built, a couple small gardens and a few more log structures, and slowly began to realize them more and more that the map they used for purchasing the land, it showed the Black River went straight across from west to east. In reality, it is somewhat more circuitous route. The promised property they were getting and the actual lines that were starting to survey, it really wasn't lining up. But they were able to entice a few more people to come along, hiring laborers, start some fledgling farms. All was going well. But then, in the August of 1794, the bloody flux epidemic began to spread to the settlers of Castorland. This waterborne contagious disease gives you terrible intestinal problems from drinking water. It's been tainted. They were alone in the wilderness, very sick, and didn't know what to do. The only place they knew that they could go, maybe get a little bit of help, and maybe a doctor, was to go to Baron Steuben's house. It wasn't that far by a straight line, day's journey if you're lucky. So they went to the Baron's house. They spent about 2 weeks recovering. The worst thing about the bloody flux is the stomach pain and the problems in your lower intestine. Many people die from dehydration. During this time, they both visited with the Baron. He talked about his plans for the property and plans to have a little settlement up there. And Farouk made a drawing based on the Baron's account. This is when the plan for the estate owned by the History Center was done. Farouk drew it in the fall of 1794 at Baron Steuben's house as he recovered from the bloody flux. The general map of Honorable William Frederick, Baron of Steuben's Manor. The drawing is signed by P. Farouk, delineated, which meant drawn, 1794. Some historians consider this one of the earliest examples of large-scale landscape planning in America. We were a new country and there weren't many rich people hiring architects to do such great plans, and there weren't many around to hire. The fact that it survives is quite remarkable. It's a tremendous, important piece of early landscape planning in America. It's certainly a one-of-a-kind piece. The grand plan for the estate of Steuben was never completed. Baron Steuben died at his home in November 1794, 2 months after Farouk made the drawing. But there's more to the story. Desjardins and Farouk recovered. It was late in the season and winter was coming. They went south down the Mohawk River back to Albany, and they spent time negotiating, talking to the Constable family, trying to rectify what was going on with the survey, and trying to get more help and come back up north and survey and farm. History Center has a letter to Charles Broadhead in 1795 offering some work on surveying land signed by Farouk. That summer they continued their work at the High Falls. They built a water-powered sawmill which allowed them to cut planks and lumber so they could build more homes and barns. In the summer of 1795 they also built a blacksmith forge which allowed them to make their own hardware, nails, and repair a lot of things. This is the same year that the Castorland coin was created. This wasn't circulating money, though it looks like a coin. It's a commemorative coin made for the investors of the company. The back of the coin depicts a woman with an inscription, "Hail, great mother of the harvests." The woman is shown with a cornucopia in her hand representing the great bounty of the new country. A sheath of wheat below her feet, below that a beaver. To her left side is a maple tree from which they are tapping maple syrup. In her hand is a tiny drill used to drill the taps for the maple tap. Symbolism of this coin embodies all the hopes and dreams of the Company of New York. Things are going well, but they needed help getting the whole colony built. They just needed more workers and families to help settle the lands. It was decided that Farouk would lead a party to Canada to see if they could recruit more help. Unfortunately, it had been raining, torrential rain that year. The river was very high. The group got on a log raft, but because the water was so high, the poles used as they crossed the river couldn't touch the bottom. They quickly became out of control and headed to the falls. Pierre Farouk couldn't swim. A later account tells it all. One of the saddest incidents in the story of Castorland is the death of Farouk at the Falls of Watertown in 1795. September that year, after heavy rains had swollen the river, Farouk set out with Broadhead and others on a journey to Kingston on the St. Lawrence. In passing down the river upon a raft, they were drawn over the falls. Mr. Broadhead and 3 men were saved, but Farouk and all the others were drowned. The survivors made an unremitting search for his body, but it was not found until the following spring. It was washed upon the shore of an island at the mouth of the Black River, where it was found by Benjamin Wright, a surveyor, and by him decently buried there. Years later, a marble tablet was set in a rock near his grave bearing this inscription: "To the memory of Peter Baruch, this island is consecrated." There's another document the History Center owns. It's a letter to Charles Broadhead at the camp at the Long Falls. He writes, "You will receive the loaves you asked for and some rum. The bottle is full." Later in the letters included this sad statement: "I've got here, you know, the compass and chain of our dead friend." This refers to the surveyor's compass and surveyor's chain, which they recovered after the tragedy. Work continued at the settlement. Desjardins went to New York and met with the constable's son to further negotiate the land. The little settlement continued to grow. They got cows, goats, and sheep. They even grew wheat and pumpkins. Several families had come. However, the board of directors in France wanted to see faster development of Castorland. Unfortunately, an American had robbed a significant amount of money in the chest from the camp. This is when the company sent a man named Rudolph Tiller. He came in 1795. He was not a nice man. Within a short time of getting to the settlement, he told Desjardins and all the hardworking settlers that everything they were doing was wrong. He was now in charge. He quickly alienated the workers who had come to work at the colony. His attitude pissed off the few neighbors in the area that could possibly assist them. Very soon, disgusted, Desjardins soon left to points unknown. Tiller was so mean that word got back to the company in France. Eventually, he was fired. They wrote to him and said they would terminate his agency and appoint another. But at the same time, he refused to give up or acknowledge the company's power to displace him. Everything dissolved into a big mess. The turmoil caused the settlers to leave. Things in France were quieting down, and some of them decided to return. In 1800, a visitor named Richard Cox visited Castorland and found the company's holding in chaos. In 1800, after contracting a debt of 300,000 livres, the company could only show one sawmill, 18 log houses, and 82 acres of clearing as the fruit of an enormous expense. There were an additional 11 log houses and 130 acres of cleared land besides what belonged to the company. Several roads had indeed been made. These were rendered impossible by the first gale of wind, want of population. It speedily relapsed into a state of nature. That was pretty much the end. Today there's a small village called Castorland. It wasn't where the settlement was located, but it's named in its memory. Beyond that, everything's gone except for a few letters and the drawing at the History Center. And with that, we close the story of Castorland and the connection between the plan of the Baron Steuben's estate, waterfalls, and beavers. Thank you for sticking around. Special thanks to the Tug Hill Commission and the Oneida County History Center and their support of the story of Castorland. If you want to see the drawing, it's not always on exhibit, so call ahead and for photos and more information, visit our website, oneidacountyhistory.org. $200